biblical flood story is the ideal passage for examining how Genesis was written. In this video, I explore its Mesopotamian background and how scholars think the story developed. To understand the story of the flood in Genesis, we need to begin in the desert. In 1849, British archaeologists began excavating the ancient city of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq. There, they uncovered the palace library of Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, which contained a treasure trove of ancient tablets written in Akkadian. Some 25,000 of these tablets were sent back to the British Museum in London, where they sat in storage for years until a young Assyriologist named George Smith was hired to organize them. He spent a decade poring over the tablets and perfecting his knowledge of Akkadian before he stumbled on a truly remarkable tablet. Smith revealed his discovery during a highly publicized lecture for the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December of 1872. It was a tablet that told a story of a great flood that sounded in many details like the tale of Noah's flood we read about in Genesis. Smith called the newly discovered text the Chaldean account of the deluge. Today we know it as the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This discovery would forever change biblical studies. It cast the primeval history of Genesis in a new light, not as a unique account of the world's beginnings, but as a text firmly rooted in the mythology and literary culture of the ancient Near East. It's important to understand that there was a widespread literary tradition in Mesopotamia regarding creation, the flood, and other stories we find in Genesis. The Epic of Gilgamesh gave us our first evidence of that tradition, and it upended the study of the Bible. Noted Bible scholar John Van Cedars, in his influential book, Prologue to History, writes, "By the mid-1st millennium BC, there was something like a classical Mesopotamian scheme for the primeval age, an Eastern antiquarian tradition. This was a learned literary tradition that maintained and transmitted the older classical works and that created new ones as the need or creative urge to do so arose. Gilgamesh itself was one of the most famous works of literature in the ancient world. One scholar has called it the most significant literary creation of the whole of ancient Mesopotamia. It was widely distributed and translated into several languages, and it survives in numerous copies from the 1st and 2nd millennia BCE, as well as through references in other ancient works. In Tablet 11, Gilgamesh meets a man named Utnapishtim who recounts the story of how he, together with his wife, survived a great flood that sounds quite a lot like the Genesis flood. Many elements of the Gilgamesh flood narrative will be familiar to anyone raised with the biblical story of Noah and the Ark. When the gods decide to destroy mankind with a deluge, Ea, the god of Utnapishtim, comes to him and instructs him to build an ark with which he is to save himself and specimens of every living creature. Ea gives him precise dimensions for this ship and instructs him to include a roof. Just as Noah did in response to Yahweh, Utnapishtim obeys all that Ea commands. Over a period of 7 days, he builds the ark with the help of workmen from the city. He covers the ark with pitch. On the last day, he boards the ark with his family and the animals. Then the storm comes with a terrible downpour and a deluge that kills all mankind. After 7 days, the storm abates, and the ark comes to rest in a mountain, Mount Nemush. After 7 more days, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, and then a raven to look for a landing place. When the raven does not return, Utnapishtim leaves the ark and, like Noah, offers a sacrifice. The gods smell the sacrifice and are pleased by its odor. Perhaps the biggest difference between Genesis and Gilgamesh is the ending, in which Ea makes Utnapishtim and his wife immortal and has them dwell far off at the source of the rivers, understood to mean the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We hear echoes of this, however, in Genesis 2, where Yahweh places Adam in Eden at the source of 4 rivers, including the Tigris and Euphrates. This flood story did not, in fact, originate with the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was borrowed in its entirety from an older work called Atrahasis. Variations of this story were incorporated into other ancient literature as well, including the Babyloniaca of Berossus and the Deucalion flood story of the Greeks. So that should give you a very basic idea of the Eastern antiquarian tradition that the flood story and other early portions of Genesis fit into. We're not quite done with Gilgamesh yet though, because the way in which Gilgamesh was written is incredibly important for understanding Genesis. Without that context, you're missing a valuable tool that can give you a deeper understanding of the text. The Gilgamesh epic began as a collection of Sumerian tales written around the 21st century BCE. In its earliest form, Gilgamesh was essentially a rewrite of 4 of those Sumerian tales. Centuries later, the flood story from another literary work, the previously mentioned Atrahasis, was incorporated. A prologue and additional story elements were also added. Further minor changes to the final version were made during the process of copying and transmitting the text. At each stage of development, the scribes felt free to adapt traditional material in accordance with their theology and to harmonize the sources they were combining. The further this process went, the more the authors were restricted by existing tradition. Geoffrey Teagate, in his definitive book on the Gilgamesh epic, explains that freedom of revision steadily decreased during the history of the epic's development. The early Babylonian version was a free paraphrase of its Sumerian sources, but later versions were much more restricted. In a highly regarded work of scholarship titled Reading the Fractures of Genesis, Professor David M. Carr of Union Theological Seminary explains that ancient literature differed from modern in very significant ways. You cannot really understand an ancient text like Genesis without being aware of these differences. Singularity of authorship. Unlike modern texts, ancient literary works often circulated anonymously. There were no authorship rights. Genesis contains no authorship claims, for example, despite its later association with Moses. Textual solidity. Whereas modern texts are protected by copyright and published in a fixed form, ancient texts like Gilgamesh or Genesis often seem to have achieved textual solidity only after they had been in circulation for a long time. The text only became fixed once it had attained authoritative status within the communities transmitting them. The genre of fiction. Modern readers expect a story to either be a work of fiction or history. Fiction is entirely the creation of the author and makes no claim to report past events. Works of history are written by a historian who builds a brand new narrative after having critically evaluated her or his sources. Ancient narrative texts like Genesis and Gilgamesh wanted to make true claims about the past, so they lacked the freedom of a modern fiction writer. But they also lacked the freedom of a history writer, because they trusted the traditions that had been handed down to them and preferred to build on those. In his book, Carr takes a fresh look at the widespread view of scholars that Genesis, like Gilgamesh and other ancient texts, was composed over time by different authors. Assuming that this is true, he asks what indicators we might look for in biblical texts that might clue us in, as he puts it, to the history of their formation. It turns out there are a number of ways in which the text of the flood story reveals clues to its transmission history. Features like doublets, contradictions, breaks in narrative structure, and shifts in terminology and ideology can indicate the scenes where multiple sources have been combined. Of course, it is perfectly possible for a single author to deliberately introduce such features for literary effect. However, if, for example, the appearance of doublets in the Genesis flood story correlates perfectly with shifts in terminology and contradictions in the text, the use of multiple sources is highly probable, especially given what we know about the formation of Gilgamesh and other ancient texts. So what sources should we be looking for in Genesis? It might seem like putting the cart before the horse, but before we examine the flood story for these clues, we need to be aware of the near-universal consensus on certain sources found in the Pentateuch. For the first potential source, let's start with a quote from Carr's book. He writes, "The identification of priestly material, or P, in the Pentateuch remains one of the better established results of biblical transmission historical research. Numerous theories about the development of the Pentateuch abound. However, it is almost universally recognized that, throughout the Pentateuch, there are numerous passages with a special interest in the establishment of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the revelation of the name Yahweh to Israel. These passages have distinctive vocabulary, ideological concerns, and a calendar system that sets them apart from the rest of the text. This layer of the text is called the priestly source, or the P source. It sets all the important events in Israel's history up to the conquest of the Promised Land as the fulfillment of a plan ordained by Yahweh at creation. A second source we should be watching out for is referred to as the Yahwist source, or J source, because Yahwist begins with a J in German. Bible scholars have recognized since the 18th century that the various passages in the Pentateuch in which Israel's deity is called Yahweh are distinct from those in which he is called Elohim. The exact nature of this source document, including its very existence, is disputed by scholars, and Carr prefers simply to call this source non-P in Genesis. I'll stick with the more typical label of J in this video. Now that we understand how ancient texts were formed, and have an idea of what sources might be found in Genesis, let's look at the text of the flood story itself. The reason for the flood is first described in Genesis 6 verses 5 to 7. Yahweh saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the ground, and it grieved him to his heart. So Yahweh said, I will blot out from the ground the men I have created, for I am sorry that I have made them. In verses 11 to 13, we are again told what the reason for the flood is. Now the earth was corrupt in Elohim's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And Elohim saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And Elohim said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to corrupt them along with the earth. Of course, it's possible for a single author to have written both passages, but if we can find shifts in wording, style, and ideology that correspond to this doublet, then the likelihood of two sources is much higher. In the first passage, the deity is called Yahweh, the reason for the flood is the evil of man. The author enjoys wordplay and uses the word ground, ha-adama, because of its similarity to the word for man, ha-adam. And Yahweh is highly anthropomorphized. He expresses sorrow and regret. Now in the second passage, the deity is instead called Elohim. The reasons for the flood are corruption and violence. The author likes using the phrase all flesh and the word earth. Elohim speaks more formally and shows no emotion. Since the first passage calls the deity Yahweh, let's tentatively assign it to the J source. The other we will tentatively assign to the P source. In Genesis 6:8, following the J source's reason for the flood, we are introduced to Noah. But Noah found favor in the sight of Yahweh. Then in the next verse, we are introduced to Noah a second time. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with the Elohim, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The main distinguishing feature in this doublet is the name of the deity, Yahweh in one case, Elohim in the other. Additionally, the names of Noah's 3 sons are found only in passages associated with the priestly source. God tells Noah twice about the flood he is going to send. The first time is in 7:4. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. The second time is in verses 17 and 18. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to corrupt from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. The vocabulary distinctions seen earlier are repeated here, and there are some new ones that will soon show a pattern. One is that the J source uses a relative chronology based on the numbers 7 and 40. Another is that the flood is caused by rain in the J source, but comes from elsewhere later on in the P source. A third is the reference to covenants, which occur only in the P source and are an important element of P's view of history. Yahweh gives Noah instructions for surviving the flood in chapter 7 verses 1 to 3. Then Yahweh said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you all clean animals 7 by 7, the husband and his wife, and a pair of the animals that are unclean, the husband and his wife, to keep their seed alive on the face of the ground. However, in a parallel section from the previous chapter, Elohim has already given an alternate version of these instructions to Noah. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Again, there are important differences to notice. The J source is careful to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. In that author's mind, it is perfectly natural that the Jewish sacrifice and dietary laws already existed in Noah's day. The P source does not mention clean or unclean animals because the Levitical laws do not exist until the time of Moses in his narrative. Another difference is that the J source refers to animal pairs as the husband and his wife. The P source uses the phrase male and female and enumerates animals with the phrase according to their kind. Noah's entry into the ark is one of the most obvious doublets in the story. In chapter 7 verses 5 and 7 we read, "And Noah did all that Yahweh had commanded him. And Noah with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood." Then, a little further on in chapter 7 verse 13, Noah again goes into the ark with his family and the animals, and we are again told in verse 22 that Noah did all that Elohim commanded him. In the text as it now stands, Noah goes into the ark twice, once at Yahweh's command, and again at Elohim's command. For the coming of the flood and the swelling of the waters, we again have 2 parallel accounts. The combined text has a confusing timeline that is impossible to reconcile, but when we separate out the parallel accounts, we can clearly see 2 sources at work. Chapter 7 verses 10, 12, and 17 give us the J version. "And after 7 days the waters of the flood came on the earth. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth." Verses 11, 18 to 20, and 24 give an alternate cause of the flood and a contradictory timeline. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Again, we see the J source's preference for durations of 7 and 40 days, while the P source uses an absolute chronology. The flood waters increase for 40 days in J, and 150 days in P. The flood comes from rain in J, and the 40-day duration is important to the logic of the story. A short period of rain, after all, would not be enough to flood the entire world and kill all mankind. This is important for another reason that we shall see further on. In P, the floodwaters come not from the rain, but from the deep, an ocean thought to have existed below the earth, and from heaven, which was thought to contain water due to its blue color. This is an example of P's more sophisticated Mesopotamian cosmology. The end of the flood is yet another doublet. In chapter 8 verses 2b to 3, we are told that the rains stop and the waters start to recede. In 6 to 7, Noah waits 40 days before sending out a raven to search for dry land. However, in 8 verses 1 to 2a, it is the closing of the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven, accompanied by a wind sent by Elohim, that caused the waters to dry up. According to verse 3, it takes 150 days, rather than 40, for the waters to abate enough for the ark to come to rest on dry land. Now, regarding the birds, in the final version of the story, Noah sends out a raven and then a dove 3 times. Most scholars assign the raven and the doves to the J source because of the 7-day intervals for the dove, but there are actually good reasons to assign the doves to the P source. That's something I'd like to explain further in another video. The story seems to have 2 separate conclusions in which the deity decides never to flood the world again. In 820 and following, Noah builds an altar to Yahweh and sacrifices every clean animal and bird. Yahweh enjoys the odor and resolves never to destroy the earth again. The chapter ends with a poem expressing Yahweh's intent never to destroy all life again, bringing closure to the story. However, in chapter 9, we get a rather different ending. Elohim blesses Noah and his sons, and then he establishes a covenant with Noah and the animals, promising to never again flood the world. Elohim also sets his bow in the sky to remind himself of this promise. Covenants that tie together the overarching story of Israel are a typical concern of the priestly author. Also note that the reasons given for the deity's promise differ in the 2 endings. In the J version, the smell of the sacrifice mollifies Yahweh. In the P version, it is the covenant. Hopefully this very brief look at some of the repetition in the flood story should help you understand why practically all scholars believe it is the work of two sources combined together. In his book, Carr addresses a key question. Were these doublets written to complement each other, or did they originate as separate sources that were only later brought together? The existence of contradictions and major conceptual differences between the doublets implies the latter. One of the most significant examples is the clear difference in how the P and J passages regard sacrifices. The passages we may tentatively label as non-P or J portray Noah as an observant Jew who knows the difference between clean and unclean animals. It specifies that 7 pairs of all the clean animals and birds are to be brought on board the ark, and it shows Noah sacrificing them to Yahweh after the flood. The passages assigned to P make no mention of sacrifices or of clean and unclean animals. If they were part of a longer narrative in which Yahweh's laws on cleanliness and sacrifices were unknown until the time of Moses, then we have an explanation for why the P version differs in this way. This tension between the two sources gives rise to another obvious contradiction, as Noah is commanded by Yahweh to take 7 pairs of all clean animals onto the ark in chapter 7 verse 2, but when he fulfills the command of Elohim in verse 9, he only takes 2 of every animal. Another example concerns the dates given within the story. As mentioned before, the chronology of the flood is highly confusing. There are both contradictions between our two sources and differences in how they date events. For example, in the J source, the 40-day flood begins 7 days after Noah's entry into the ark. In the P strand, the flood begins on the very same day that Noah enters the ark. It is hard to pick up on this contradiction without separating the text into its sources, because the J notice that the flood lasted 40 days has been inserted before P's statement about that very same day, obscuring which day the statement refers to. The duration of the flood differs significantly as well. In the J source, the rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. In the P source, the waters swell for 150 days and then abate for 150 days. Overall, the J source uses relative dates based on 7-day and 40-day intervals. The P source, however, uses an absolute calendar-based dating system. The flood starts on the 17th day of the 2nd month in the 600th year of Noah's life. Picking apart this chronological system is quite interesting, but I'll leave that for another video. Belgian scholar and Pentateuch expert Jean-Louis Scott stresses the importance of recognizing and accepting these disagreements in the flood story. He writes, "The present account of the flood is like a cantata sung by 2 or more voices. The universe could only be destroyed once, and it was therefore difficult to relate the event 2 times. The message, nevertheless, is polyphonic. A reading that would attempt to eliminate the different voices in order to defend the unity of the composition would not only risk abolishing certain facts in the texts, but also leaving an important part of the message out." This analysis so far strongly suggests that the Genesis flood story is the result of interweaving 2 different strands from 2 sources, P and J, that appear to have existed as independent documents in some form. Nevertheless, there is an obvious close relationship between P and J. As Carr notes, the 2 strands are extremely similar to each other, matching episode to episode, even sub-episode to sub-episode, and comment to comment. They share some rare vocabulary and are more similar to each other than to the non-biblical flood stories, such as Gilgamesh, that influenced them. In other words, it is likely either that P is dependent on J, meaning that it copied and altered J's version of the flood story, or that the reverse is true and J is dependent on P. Are there any clues in the text as to which way the dependence goes? Carr finds 2 reasons that P seems to be dependent on J in the flood story. One is that P seems to consistently expand upon the framework of J. For example, it expands the description of the rising waters, it elaborates on Elohim's decision to end the flood, and it turns J's simple promise at the end of the flood into a lengthy covenant. The other reason is that P's chronology seems to imitate J, albeit with changes, even though P's other changes render much of the chronology unimportant. For example, the length of the rain in J, 40 days and nights, is a vital story component as it explains how the waters got so high. In P's version, the floodwaters come from the heavens and the deep, ideas related to Mesopotamian cosmology that will be explored in another video, so the duration doesn't really matter. However, P still imitates J by giving a precise length of time for the flood and its abatement, 150 days for each. This conclusion is widely shared by other scholars. For example, David L. Peterson, in a 2007 paper, observes that while the earlier Israelite version stays close to the ancient Atrahasis myth, the priestly version solves several theological issues with the Yahwist story and adds a new cosmic perspective. Peterson concludes that, clearly, a priestly hand has vigorously rewritten a major moment in Israel's primeval literature. Carr applies a similar analysis to the whole of Genesis and finds that the same patterns apply throughout. Prior to the formation of the Pentateuch, there was an author, or authors, who rewrote existing stories and traditions to create a new conceptualization of Israel's history. In his book, Carr concludes, from his analysis of the many parallels between P and non-P sources throughout Genesis, that the bulk of priestly material in Genesis appears to have once been part of an originally freestanding, separate P source. It was a counter-narrative apparently designed to replace its non-P counterpart. However, in what Carr describes as a remarkable intertextual move, a redactor took this document, which we've been calling the priestly source, and combined it with the material it was intended to replace, interweaving the material and making additions to smooth over some of the cracks. In this video, I've examined the flood story and its formation on the basis of the research published by several leading scholars. We've hardly scratched the surface of this topic, but I hope the following points have been adequately made. 1. The writing of history-like texts was a process that took place over time and often involved the combining of multiple sources into a new literary creation. 2. The fractures in a biblical text, doublets, narrative contradictions, terminology shifts, and so on, provide clues to its formation. 3. The Genesis flood story appears to be a combination of two primary sources that most scholars refer to as the priestly source and the Yahwist or non-priestly source. 4. The Yahwist source was probably earlier, and it closely follows the plot of the flood story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. 5. The priestly document was probably based on the Yahwist source and was written to replace it. 6. What we ended up with, however, is a flood story that deftly interweaves both versions of the story. I hope that this video and the ones that follow help regular people interested in the Bible, both religious and non-religious, to find a new way to understand and appreciate its contents. You can check out the links below for a related blog post, as well as a parallel version of the flood story that separates the two sources into their own respective narratives. Thanks for watching.